Hello, everyone. Welcome back to English 1120, War in Literature. This is our third of 5 lectures on Homer's Iliad. In the first lecture on the Iliad, we covered Book 1 and notably the issues around honor and glory that were really driving the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles that begins the epic. We also looked in that first lecture at Mycenaean warfare generally and as it's represented in Homer. And then for our second lecture on the Iliad, we looked at an overview, first of all, of books 2 to 8, which you were not required to read, but just so that you know what was happening in the plot, we did a bit of a plot summary of those books, including notions there of Aristeia. We looked at the relationship between gods and mortals when we looked at book 9. During the overview of books 2 to 8, we also looked in particular at life in Troy as a contrast to the life of war, a vignette of what the warrior is fighting to preserve in terms of the life of the family and the life of the community, when we see Hector with his family and relating to others in Troy, quite a poignant book. So today, that's what we covered in the first 2 lectures. Today, we're going to look at an overview of books 10 to 15, which you were not required to read, before we get to the Death of Patroclus, that's depicted in books 16 and 17. So you were asked to read book 16 for today. And without further ado, let's pull up the presentation that'll guide us through this. Okay, so to begin our overview of books 10 to 15, I'll point out that in book 11, Zeus sends Iris to tell Hector to hold back from advancing the Trojan troops until he sees that Agamemnon is wounded. This allows space in the early part of book 11 for Agamemnon to have a very brief Aristeia. And Zeus promises to Hector that he will have a full day of unrivaled greatness. And this day lasts from book 11 through to book 18, line 276. So it's sometimes referred to as the longest day. The sun is prevented from setting to prolong this day. So once Agamemnon is wounded and withdraws from battle, Hector rallies his men and rushes into battle, where he kills many and has a sort of Aristeia of his own. Diomedes and Odysseus are both wounded. It means that the only outstanding Greek warrior left is Ajax the Greater. So he's depicted as larger than the others, as strong. The only warrior he's not as strong as is Achilles. And basically, it's Ajax who valiantly, he's depicted later on in this sequence as leaping from ship to ship, holding off the Trojans almost single-handedly. So the Trojans are having a period of superiority. They're at the Greek walls, so the Greeks have set up a wall, a makeshift wall, obviously not as developed as the Trojan walls around the city, but makeshift walls, as well as a ditch around their ships at the beach. At Hector's urging, the Trojans attack the trench and wall, and Sarpedon makes the first breach in the wall, and Hector smashes the gate of the wall with a large stone. In this scene, I want to highlight something I've mentioned before, this notion that comes up frequently in Homer of the greatness of the ancestors. So, and let's say contrast that with what we'll definitely see in more modern works, where there might be referred to let's say the Henry V's predecessors are referred to, but in no sense, I think, can we say that seriously the play depicts to us a sense that Henry V's ancestors are superior by in kind to the warriors that are fighting in the Battle of Agincourt. That's quite distinct here from Homer, where as great as Achilles is, whereas great as Odysseus is, from the perspective of Homer's listeners, who again, remember, are hundreds of years, generations separated from this heroic age that's depicted in the Iliad. As great as those heroes were, Homer insists that the generations that preceded them were even greater. And so in this sequence, the narrator stresses the physical prowess of the heroes of Troy and their predecessors to modern men. So the people that are listening in Homer's day. So he depicts Hector easily lifting this huge boulder that two men today could not budge. So that's in book 12. And then similarly in book 5, Diomedes does the same thing, hurls this huge boulder, and it has the same narrative comment that two people couldn't budge this boulder today, and he threw it like it was a toy. And then in book 20, and the lines are there, the same incident is described with Aeneas throwing a boulder. So again, this is reiterated in terms of our relation, our weakness to the heroes in Troy. They can throw these boulders that two people in our day could not budge. And then remember the words of Nestor early on in book 1, saying that, you know, those great heroes were nothing compared to the heroes of his own of his prime. So let's say a generation earlier, Theseus, and those who are much even greater than Achilles and others. So what's at stake there is this sense that the ways of the ancestors are greater than anything we can come up with. So there's no use trying to become innovative or scientific, or try to quote unquote progress and come up with a better way to organize ourselves socially, to relate to one another. The ancestors were greater than us physically, morally, and we would do best to follow what was set down by them. Again, this is opposed to a generally modern point of departure that sees us as either greater than the ancestors because we've progressed in terms of what we know and the moral horizons, even we're morally progressed, or that maybe we're no different morally or in terms of our knowledge, but we've been able to stand on their shoulders and accumulate more knowledge over time. So we also get a depiction here again of Agamemnon as a leader. So I've mentioned a couple times about Agamemnon's presented as this flawed leader in the Iliad. He expresses in this sequence despair, and again suggests that the Greeks should sail away by night. And Diomedes suggests instead that they should return to the field of battle despite the fact that they're wounded, in order to encourage the other Greeks to fight. So if it hadn't been for Diomedes and Odysseus jumping in, you know, Agamemnon is bewildered, is on the verge of panic, and the Greek cause would be lost, really. And Ajax the Greater wounds Hector at this point by hitting him with a boulder. The only reason he's able to do this, because Hector had been granted this period of predominance by Zeus, is that Hera had seduced Zeus. This is kind of a famous episode. So Zeus is seduced by Hera. He's distracted. So and it was Zeus's, let's say, divine protection that had been given Hector this predominance. Zeus is distracted. Hector's kind of at the whims of the contingencies of warfare, and Ajax wounds him with that boulder. So in book 15, Hector regains his strength, returns to battle, and again with Hector leading, the Trojans break through the Greek walls and reach the ships, and he calls for fire to burn the ships. And note, this is what the point really where Achilles had said that I will withdraw until the Trojans are at the ships. You know, I will. It's not until that point will I rejoin the fighting. And even now, he's not as though he's jumping out to help. So Hector calls for fire to burn the ships, and as I mentioned, you know, Ajax is valiantly leaping from deck to deck, single-handedly holding off these Trojans. At this point, so it's a bit of a recap from books 10 to 15. You have a sense of where we are in the fighting and in the story of the Iliad. I want to take a moment now to go into a bit more depth into something we've mentioned in passing a couple of times, and that's Homer's use of similes and some of the effects that Homer is able to convey with his use of similes. So we remember that simile is a comparison of two things, two images, two concepts using like or as. So a metaphor is also a comparison without the like or an as. It just these two things are the same, so to speak. So an epic simile, remember we mentioned, tries to do that comparison in such a way that rather than just those two images or those two objects or actions being compared, it pulls in other cultural references. It becomes an expansive simile. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind here is the different types of similes, and I'll try to highlight just a few here that Homer is able to use, and they have, let's say, complementary and different effects. So one, as I have indicated here, is often the similes are comparing two things that are ostensibly quite opposed. So two contrasting things or images, and bringing them together so that we're forced to really see them in relief with one another. And this one's from book 8, and we'll look at the lines in a second, but basically the hero falling in battle is compared to a poppy drooping in the rains of spring. The hero's like a flower because his bent figure resembles the flower's curved stem. So normally we would think of these figures as quite opposed. You know, the hero's an aggressive warrior, the flower is passive vegetation, the hero's dying, whereas the flower will thrive in the rain, after the rain. But here the two opposed images are brought together. And here's the lines. As a garden poppy burst into red bloom bends, drooping its head to one side, weighed down by its full seeds in a sudden spring shower, so Gorgithion's head fell limp over one shoulder, weighed down by his helmet. So that's book 8, just before the embassy to Achilles that we talked about. So, one thing I wanted to, one of the effects there is the scene, let's say the scene of a beautiful flower, you know, in terms of contrasting that with the scenes of deadly warfare that we've been seeing, provides a type of contrast that adds sharpness to the representation. By contrasting the two things, we're reminded of, in a way, how brutal war is. Like we're not allowed to become, let's say, desensitized to the brutality of the killing, because the comparisons remind us of the opposite, and that life can be beautiful, and it can be flowers, and it can be something that grows in spring, and we're reminded of that in the midst of the carnage. And as I have here on the slide, maybe things to think about that would be similar would be in let's say, a loud musical number that's quite aggressive. Maybe the rhythm is quite fast, and it's quite a heavy rock tune, so to speak. And then, back in my day, in the grunge era, they would go fast, 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 slow, and then slow it down, and that contrast provided a very cool relief, so to speak. Or a scene of, the other thing I was thinking about would be a fast-paced movie, an action adventure movie, and then they slow it down after some chase. They slow it down. They're back at the hideout. It's just one-on-one with the two buddies who are being chased, or who are doing the chasing, what have you. And there's chance for character development and softer kind of exchange of dialogue, but also a relief from the action, a quiet moment that puts the action in relief. So that's a bit of what's going on in that type of simile. The other similes that are very prevalent, I think you'll notice it even just from the books that we've read, is comparison of a character to a wild animal, especially characters that are in the midst of these Aristeia, if they're in the midst of kind of a war carnage and war prowess. They are like a wild animal, and wild animals, let's say, that threaten the domestic civility of a human community. So here, and this is kind of a reminder of how different Greece was 3,000 years ago, but often that, and these are just depicted as average everyday occurrences, the depiction is of lions that are threatening shepherds or farmers who are just going about their daily affairs. So again, we don't see a lot of lions on mainland Europe unless they've escaped from zoos these days. But at that time, I guess it's a real threat, right? So lions, wolves, wild boars, these types of these wild animals that when in the woods, or when tending the flock of these sheep, the shepherd has to be careful. So too here, if we'll look at a comparison of Diomedes. So this is Diomedes during his Aristeia, and he's compared to a wild lion. So let's go and look at that. So yeah, this is book 5. Now long ablaze as he was to fight the Trojans, triple the fury seized him, claw mad as a lion some shepherd tending woolly flocks in the field has just grazed, a lion leaping into the fold. But he hasn't killed him, only spurred his strength, and helpless to beat him off, the man scurries for shelter, leaving his flocks panicked, lost as the ramping beast mauls them thick and fast, piling corpse on corpse, and in one furious bound clears the fence yard. So raging Diomedes mauled the Trojans. So remember that all that depiction of, just as we see often shepherds trying to protect a flock from a lion, so too, or so raging Diomedes mauled the Trojans. It's that one line that brings us back to the action of the epic and the story that we've been following. I want to jump to another simile that this is book 11. So this is a slightly different type, but it's again it's a reference to, let's say, civilized behavior. That was to a wild animals, but this is to, let's say, civilized behavior of say domestic activity, humans farming, humans doing kind of labor. So on the one hand, a raging warrior in an Aristeia can be like a wild animal in its rage and something that kind of threatens civility. But on the other hand, some of the similes will compare the act of war as almost as banal as in this case, reapers going to harvest wheat or barley. So here the slashing of these soldiers is compared to the reapers harvesting wheat or barley. So this is book 11. And the men, like gangs of reapers, slashing down the reaping rows and coming closer, closer across the field of a warlord rich in wheat and barley, swaths by the armfuls falling thick and fast. So the Achaeans and Trojans closed and slashed, lunging into each other, and neither side now had a thought of flight that would have meant disaster. So I'll stop there and go back to the presentation. As I note here in the first comparison, the Diomedes to the wild animal, I would say I haven't done a quantitative analysis of this, but I have a sense that it's most often the Greeks that in their war frenzy are compared to animal predators, and remind ourselves that it's the Trojans they're the only ones we see in a domestic setting. We see them in the city. We see them with family members. We see that which could be destroyed by these attackers, the Greeks. So the Greeks, in some ways, do represent this kind of wild animal, that which is savage and outside the community that could threaten its safety, more so than the Trojans do directly to the civilized life of the Greeks. And we talked a bit about this, the second simile in terms of the armies being like gangs of reapers. The other point I'll just highlight is that in being compared to let's say a normal human activity of everyday peaceful existence, it's drawing together two things that we would think are quite distinct. Risking one's life, and one where it's more banal. But by bringing them together, I think Homer wants to say that there is a human dignity and meaning even in these daily labors that seem less heroic than these warrior feats, because of the limited share of life, the limited moira. We talked a bit about that last time, this limited share, moira, portion that each human is given. So we are given this limited portion, and you've taken that and you've invested it in caring for your community, your family. And so Homer is able to make this comparison and show that they're similar. But Homer never forgets, though, that it's in acts of war, though, in those heroic feats in war, that human dignity shines most brightly, and that's why we're going to fixate on it. And we see the human shine to its fullest. And in that sense, he's, let's say, distinguishing himself from Hesiod. So Hesiod has a whole epic poem on works and days. So for him, you could write an epic poem just on farming, so to speak. But for Homer, not so. For Homer, sure, that's heroic, but what shines as more heroic is someone who is taking that limited share and making it even shorter, so to speak. So in book 12, I'll just refer you to those lines. We won't go read them, but the Greeks' protective wall around their ships would be taken down by the gods Apollo and Poseidon after the fighting. And here we get this sense of all this human effort around the war, and human constructions, and the 1,000 ships that were launched from Greece, and the tens of thousands of soldiers that are involved in the fight, and the walls, as I said, that were constructed are mere toys for the gods to kick over. And Troy will fall, so will other human cities. So there's this notion of it's perishable and feeble, all these great efforts and these monumental tasks that humans have tried to undertake. And it also reminded me, I'd seen a story rather recently about, let's say, D-Day. So D-Day, on the beaches of Normandy there, largest invasion ever, the industrial might that was poured on those beaches, and the tons and tons of metal and shrapnel from artillery on both sides and what have you, and now they can, there's almost no traces there. There's some traces, there's monuments that are preserved, and they can, in the sand, they can find certain, X parts per million of metallic particles that are there from D-Day, and they're saying, oh boy, that's kind of a lasting effect of it. But it also, it kind of points to, like, it's not perceptible. It's so minute, and time, even in not even 100 years, has washed away that monumental human efforts almost completely. So too, obviously, in this and this beach invasion of Troy by the Greeks. War, and here's, I'm just pointing to, again, another line that I'll refer you to, of where we get this sense of war as this kind of permanent cosmic feature, or element of the cosmos that we talked about in the first lecture about the themes of war in literature. So this is Odysseus. So he says that the Greeks are the men whom Zeus decrees from youth to old age must wind down our brutal wars to the bitter end until we drop and die down to the last man. So this sense that war is part of their, especially of the Greeks, but of all kind of human existence, in a sense that it's not as though it's going to be a brief period that's a little punctuation point in a life otherwise lived peacefully, that it's always in the background. So now we get to the death of Patroclus as depicted in books 16 and 17. Recall I asked you to read book 16, where Patroclus actually dies, and then book 17 we see a bit of the aftermath of that. So recall that the Trojans are right at the Greeks' ships. Things are not looking good. Achilles still hasn't jumped up and offered to help, unfortunately. So Patroclus, who's not quite the warrior that Achilles is, but a good friend of Achilles, says that asks Achilles if he can take his armor to go out and help the Greeks fend off the Trojans. Achilles agrees. He tells Patroclus that he's not to try to rush toward the Trojan walls, that he's just to fight them off of the ships. And Patroclus has an Aristeia, which this period of excellence in fighting. He's able to dispatch. He seems to be invincible, as everyone is during their Aristeia. He's able to dispatch other heroes rather easily, including Zeus's son Sarpedon. And Sarpedon, for a moment there, Zeus considers, as we mentioned, I think, in passing when we talked about fate and the gods in relation to fate. So Zeus was mulling it over, like, so boy, I don't want to lose my son Sarpedon. What can be done about this? And he's kind of reminded that he's not supposed to tamper with these things, that this is fated, and that there'll be grave consequences. Sarpedon's death also, the other thing I'll note there is that it prefigures the deaths of Patroclus and Hector by setting up a few themes that will recur in their deaths. So the dead man's honor is stripped from his body. There's a fierce fight for the possession of the corpse, and the gods intervene to protect the body from corruption and degradation. So Patroclus, of course, ignores Achilles' advice, and he rushes, after beating the Trojans back, rushes towards the wall of Troy. Finally, he's slain by Hector with the aid of Apollo, and with his dying words, Patroclus prophesies that Achilles will kill Hector but Hector doesn't accept the prophecy. He thinks it's nonsense. And I think here we see kind of, let's say, the human limits of characters such as Hector and Patroclus, who they're essentially human, like all humans. We don't see the future. Achilles, unlike these characters, has a sense of his fate. There's a lot of limits to Achilles, but in terms of this one aspect of knowing our fates, Achilles seems to be the exception. We don't know our fates, and there's gonna be signs, etc. We're gonna misinterpret them. We're gonna forget things. We're gonna overlook certain predictions. So book 16 ends with the death of Patroclus. In book 17, Menelaus and Hector fight over Patroclus' body, and Hector strips the armor and puts it on. And then there's a very touching scene that we will turn to, where Achilles, immortal horses, so he lent his chariot to Patroclus, and there were these immortal horses that are on this chariot team, and they weep for Patroclus, and Zeus pities them. So let's turn to book 17, that excerpt, if we can find it. So yeah, this is book 17, round 509. And Zeus pitied them. Watching their tears flow, he shook his head and addressed his own deep heart. Poor creatures, why did we give you to King Peleus, that's Achilles' father, a mortal doomed to death, you immortal beasts who never age or die, so you could suffer the pains of wretched men? There is nothing alive more agonized than man, of all that breathe and crawl across the earth. But Hector at least will never ride behind you. You and your blazoned chariot, I will never permit it. So a couple of things there. I would say the immortal horses are contrasted with human existence in the same way the gods are, right? So they're immortal, and it highlights, well, in this case, what's underlined from the perspective of Zeus, how miserable human existence is, because it's short and is a limited duration, and it is nothing but suffering. Okay, so as I said, that contrast with the gods. Also, I would say in Homer, it highlights the dignity and the meaning of human existence, because it is so, it may be short, it may be full of suffering, it may be miserable, but it has a meaning because of all those things, whereas the immortal existence of the gods does not. So a telling, and let's say a tragic description of the human existence, in keeping with our comparison of the gods and mortals, the fact that, you know, the only meaning we can find in our existence is in its brevity and in that suffering, but the fact that that is all that there is tragic from the kind of the divine perspective. So a messenger, this, I've always thought that this was probably the crappiest job in all of world literature. It was maybe the person who got sent to tell Achilles that Patroclus died, because Lord knows what Achilles' response was going to be. But so someone is sent to tell Achilles of Patroclus' death, and he takes it less than stoically. He, you know, there's bouts of weeping, rage, etc. This death of Patroclus changes the focus, and it's the kind of the turning point of the whole narrative. It changes the focus of the narrative, and there's a change in Achilles. So Achilles is no longer withdrawn because of a bruised ego and rage over his lost teammate or honor. He's now raging because of grief for his lost friend, but also out of a desire for revenge. So for the rest of the Iliad, it's this pursuit of revenge against Hector, and that will motivate the last part of the Iliad. So I'm going to stop there. So today we looked at an overview of books 10 to 15. We had a brief look at books 16 and 17, the Death of Patroclus. We looked at epic similes, what kinds of epic similes we can encounter in the Iliad, and what are the types of messages that they can convey. And in the next lecture, we'll start to look at book 18 and onward. And in book 18, we have the famous scene of Hephaestus, the god, crafting a new shield for Achilles. Thank you.